Thank you, everybody, for joining us live. This is the second webinar that talks about having even ground. In this case, we're talking about fieldwork accessibility for LGBTQIA+ people. And this is presented by myself and Clara Barker, here connected. And so welcome, everybody. We are part of the Pride group, who's a active group that was, let's say, founded in 2019. We now have a Discord channel that we organize our activities during the year and during the General Assembly. You can keep an eye out for the next General Assembly in 25, where we're going to be organizing a short course and some networking events. But we are not here for that. We want to actually hear more about the challenges of fieldwork. I want to now pass the word to Clara, who will keep doing the introduction. Thank you, Clara.
Hey everyone, and I should point out that today is actually International LGBTQ+ Day. So happy International LGBTQ+ Day to everyone. It's been running a few years, founded by a few friends of mine in Pride in STEM and a few other organizations, and it's great that there's lots of stuff going on around the countries and around different places as well on this day. So it's really good. It's been catching on. And I guess, so we're here to talk specifically about fieldwork, and fieldwork is an important thing for LGBTIQ+ people in science. So obviously we often say that it doesn't matter, you know, there's no such thing as identity politics, science doesn't care, but actually when it comes to fieldwork, and that can include going to conferences, actually it does. It does have an impact on people. Now, I'm not going to sort of go into this too much because we've got fantastic speakers who can talk of their experiences and share. But I will just make you aware that being gay is illegal in 58 countries around the world, and it's punishable by death in certain countries. So if we decide to have a conference, or if we choose to go and do some fieldwork somewhere, your staff, your students, your researchers could end up in prison. They could end up being punished quite severely. And there's also lots of different countries where there are different rules. So I, as a trans person, am not safe to go to an awful lot of countries right now. And there is this, I should have put the reference on, hopefully it's on the next page. If we go to the next page, there is a breakdown on Equaldex, which has lots of different stuff. There's 2 pages of this, but for instance, you know, Hungary, they made it illegal. They removed any legal recognition of transgender people in 2018. So that's fairly frequent. So these things are changing. As it happens, when I talked about being punishable by death, there's actually one country that removed it, but at the same time, another country introduced being punishable by death if you are gay or take part in same-sex activities. So we've got to keep an eye on this, and there are countries around the world, quite a few, where actually there's no legal protections for our researchers, for housing, for work, and also, you know, maybe if you're in a same-sex couple, maybe you're just visiting somewhere for a while. But unfortunately, I've spoken to students who, people from their home countries have seen things on, say, Facebook or Instagram, and use that to, I know of 2 students that have been added to terrorist watch lists because they were photographed in LGBT clubs, even though they weren't at the front of the picture. So it does have a real impact. And there is this question, I know sometimes we've heard, if you're going to go to work in another country, then, you know, maybe you should moderate your social media. But you've got to think of the implications of that. Should you as a person have to go in and change all your personal social media? So I can't remember what else. I think, was there a 3rd slide? Yeah. So like I said, there's certain countries where we can have LGBT people serving in the military, but then other countries where conversion therapy is legal, for instance, including the UK as it happens. And there can be legal discrimination of LGBT people in certain countries as well when it comes to employment and renting. So that is sort of the global thing. And these are the things, these are real issues that we have to think about. And I certainly, since I transitioned, have to consider very carefully where I go. And the world is changing quite quickly. Even the United States, some states I feel safe to go to and some states I don't. Whether that's going to be the same next year, I couldn't tell you. So around the world, these things are changing. It's been changing a lot in Europe as well. So with that, we should go on to our main talks where they'll talk about some of the specifics. So I have three fantastic speakers today. So we have Jamie Kuhn, and they are working in Indiana in the USA. I'm not going to go into the bios too much, but you can introduce yourself. I'm right, Jamie and Nathan are going to be doing a presentation together. So Nathan is a postdoc researcher in Illinois, University of Illinois in the United States. And again, these are people that are out actually doing field work. So these are people with lived experience, but also have written a paper with lots of other people with lived experience. And so they can talk about some of the issues that they have faced or their colleagues have faced. And Kay, they're an assistant professor of oceanography in Alaska, Fairbanks. But they are going to talk specifically about the issues when it comes to being on boats and ships and doing that kind of work, which seems very interesting. I spend all my day in the basement, so the idea that you might actually see sunshine and rain, but the idea that you could see any of that is actually quite exciting to me. So without further ado, let's we can move on. So the first talk is best practices for LGBTQ+ inclusion in ecological fieldwork by Jamie and Nathan, and then we're going to navigating gender at sea by Kay. So with that, let's turn over to Jamie and Nathan.
And while we get the slides up here, I just wanted to say that Nathan and I are both on the ecological side of things, but we specifically think that a lot of our fieldwork is applicable and recommendations are applicable to folks that do all kinds of different fieldwork. So that is the background we're coming from. And while you'll see some pictures of birds and plants, but we do apply this more broadly to just thinking about doing fieldwork in rural environments. The recommendations we're going to talk about today come from a paper in Journal of Applied Ecology. And so if you want to get more depth or read more about it, you can check out that article. We're going to be summarizing some of our findings here today. So big picture roadmap of what we're going to talk about and how we think about LGBTQ inclusion in fieldwork. We have 3 levels of recommendations. The first level is institutional support, and then we have affirming mentorship recommendations, and then we have recommendations for LGBTQ individuals relating to personal safety and disclosure. And in the paper, we actually kind of break the fourth wall and we talk directly to young LGBTQ folks who are thinking about undertaking fieldwork. And so that's something that I really like about what we talked about, and we have recommendations that go through those 3 different levels. And our goal is to go from having these barriers to more affirming practices. Our authorship team, as was mentioned, encompasses a lot of different lived experiences. We are a group of early career folks, academic and non-academic, from trans-masc, trans-femme, non-binary, gay, lesbian, bisexual. We were able to collect a lot of different identities together, including some of my undergraduate students are co-authors. We have a few professors on there, some grad students. We also uniquely have folks with expertise in things like counseling psychology. So not just ecologists. We tried to bring together a diversity of viewpoints in order to be able to make our recommendations grounded not only in lived experience, but also information from different fields that are relevant to this. So just to introduce fieldwork in isolated locations, which both me and Nathan do fieldwork in isolated locations, can be unwelcoming and can threaten the safety of LGBTQ people. In addition, this isolation heightens existing safety risks and insufficient support by LGBTQ people. So when you don't have access to potentially internet or community, that isolation can make it so those safety risks are even worse. So there was a study done in 2020 that found that within ecology, specifically, LGBTQ scientists were nearly 4 times as likely to report that their sexual orientation was a barrier to their academic practice compared to heterosexual scientists. So this is something that is being experienced by across the field. And importantly, negative fieldwork experiences can alter our career trajectories. You're a student embarking on your first fieldwork experience, you experience homophobia or transphobia or something scary, that can change your entire career plans. And so this is critical in terms of also supporting diversity within our fields. So for me, personally, why we decided to write this paper and put together these recommendations for more inclusive fieldwork has to do with my students. So I lead teams of students in the field each summer, and I work at a very small college, and we are interesting in that about last survey we did, at least 40% of our students belong to the LGBTQ community. And a few of my students had negative experiences out in the field, and it made me want to collect together some recommendations for other folks. The way that I persisted in the field was by talking to other people and kind of sharing resilience strategies among my networks. And so we thought, as Nathan and I, as we were talking about writing this paper, is we wanted to take these recommendations and share them more broadly so that we could help more people. In addition, in this paper, we really wanted to have increased efforts focused on not just interpersonal recommendations. So yes, we should be using correct pronouns and treating people with respect, but we also need to focus on survival needs and structural barriers. And we didn't want to focus on the idea of conformity, the just like everyone else kind of argument and small personal actions. We wanted to have a more holistic view and kind of celebrate queerness at the same time as we're advocating for inclusion.
And as Clara mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of variation in the amount of structural inclusion that we can have, either from a national or global level, where there's various protections from different countries based off of legality or policy. But even within these countries, like the US, we can have a wide range of variations where even state boundaries or municipal boundaries can have drastically different laws and protections. And although we are working at either government institutions or institutions of higher learning, these state regulations can have kind of limiting effects of how much protection can actually be provided by any organization. And so it's just a very complex landscape. And with the ways that protections are enacted, either through court cases or through legislative policy, the stability of those protections are very variable and change very rapidly. And this can be for housing, where LGBTQ students or people may experience disownment and homelessness at higher rates. There might be medical inaccessibility, where hormone replacement therapy or gender-affirming providers are not available in some of these states or in rural locations. There's the added pressure of, particularly in rural settings, of kind of this idea of heteronormativity, where queer behavior is viewed more negatively than hetero behavior. And this kind of creates some isolating effects that can increase bullying, can increase depression, can increase victimization, and impact mental health. It can lead to coerced invisibility and erasure, where you hide your identity at work to reduce risk. This is one of the strategies I often did because I could, where in a lot of field settings, I was in the middle of the forest with 20 people in a tent for 3 months, and it wasn't really a point that I needed to bring up in that setting. But at the same time, it kind of isolates you from the other group or the rest of the researchers in such a way where you start to feel a little bit more distant from your coworkers, or you don't necessarily have the same fieldwork bonds that you form with friends. And this can all compound to kind of reduce the well-being and impact future careers, because if you're having negative experiences in the field, if you're not having the structural support to be able to even get to the field or survive and thrive in the field, then you're not going to be able to effectively pursue this career in the same manner as if you didn't have to worry about those concerns or manage any of those concerns.
So getting into that three-tiered approach that we talked about before, we're going to summarize some of the recommendations we have to make fieldwork more inclusive, starting at the institutional level. So first, we believe that institutions should require field safety and procedures plans. In fact, I share my field safety and procedures plans with my students prior to the field. I try to plan for everything that I can that might affect my students, but I don't always know everyone's specific situation. So I share what an average day looks like, how we manage safety, and give students an opportunity to, or other mentees, an opportunity to reach out to me to see if there's anything that needs to be changed. For example, I work in a grassland. There is no cover for going to the bathroom in the field. And so having it written out how we take care of that can allow students to make sure that that is accessible to them. We also recommend providing adequate and inclusive housing options, not making assumptions on how people should be distributed into different housing arrangements based on gender or assumed gender. And we also feel like we need to make a plan for things like bathroom access in general and communicate that plan, which is a particular need for a lot of trans individuals. I know that Nathan has talked about using a lot of rural gas stations for going to the bathroom in the field, which is very different from my fieldwork situation. So there's a lot of context dependent stuff, but just making sure that's communicated and then there's a plan in place for your trans and LGBTQ individuals. We also feel like institutions should help manage safety, thinking about where you're going in the world, what the potential safety implications might be, and making sure that you're sending, in my situation, I always send people out in pairs and we have radios and we stay in contact, the types of things that will keep LGBTQ individuals safe, also keep other people safe in this situation. As Nathan talked about, there's a lot of structural and societal barriers that might mean that some LGBTQ individual might not have access to the same resources, things like increased rates of homelessness and family disownment. And so providing financial support, not having unpaid internships and other resources, and having size inclusive gear are all things that can help increase the accessibility of the field. Also, sometimes, especially when traveling internationally, but also sometimes traveling domestically, there can be a need to support paperwork. And so institutions should have an established pathway for assisting folks with passports and other related paperwork. I know for my field site, I often am helping students transfer prescriptions to local pharmacies, for example. And because I've done it before, I know the way to do it. And so this is something that is also something that should happen at the institutional level. Next, we have recommendations for fieldwork supervisors. First, just getting educated on LGBTQ inclusion in fieldwork. There's a lot of papers out here. You're going to hear from some folks here today. There's a lot of blog posts. There's a lot of information out there, and this field is changing. And so staying up on it and being educated is very important. We also suggest being vocal in advocacy. When students see me on campus, for example, advocating for a gender neutral bathroom, then they know that I support them. So being vocal and supporting my queer and trans students. There's also a lot of ways you can build trust and rapport, having explicit conversations about inclusion and exclusion on field teams, making sure that people can come to you if they do feel like they need to. Building those types of teams can help folks feel more included. And then I'm going to let Nathan take the next one.
And then I was just saying, be supportive of variable identity disclosure. So in certain settings, your students may be able to may want to go by a certain pronoun or go by a certain name. However, that name might not be safe broadly. So if a student or a researcher approaches you and comes out to you as a specific identity with specific pronouns, respect that, but then do a follow-up and ask, when is it okay to use these, and what are settings in which I should not use these? And just being respectful of those types of variations in how people are choosing to present in different settings. And the next one is to be aware of cybersecurity risks. There's a lot of apps targeted for connecting with particularly gay men individuals, although there's apps for everyone at this point. So this is often a location-based type of app where it can help with identifying local community. You can learn the local lay of the land for LGBTQ resources, and you can talk to people online if you're in a setting that you're unfamiliar with. However, at the same time, this can pose risks where if somebody on the team is not out, you may identify that, or you may find out that they are a member of the community, and how do you navigate if they start harassing you? How do you navigate how do you navigate if somebody is harassing you but they are not out, and where do you kind of draw the line between your own protection and outing somebody and their protection? And also, especially in this current climate, there's a lot of risks as well with victimization from these apps, where recently in Maryland, a person was lured and then entrapped by a fraternity and then beaten and tortured because he was gay off of one of these apps. And we've seen this kind of across the globe as well. A lot of this is very similar to some of the tactics used in Russia back in the 2010s. And so just having an awareness of these cybersecurity risks that your team may experience, you don't necessarily need to know all of the behaviors or engagements that they are doing in their personal life, but just as part of a general safety plan, be aware of the setting that you're going into and know that these apps exist and there are safety concerns associated with them, as well as mental health benefits of finding community.
I often recommend to my students to use the buddy system. And also I prefer folks check in like when they're coming back. We live in a field house all together, so that's quite possible. It'll depend on your context, what makes the most sense. And then finally, one of our next recommendations is if a mentor is belonging to the LGBTQ community, to consider disclosing identity if you feel safe doing so. There can be a lot of benefits in terms of role models and seeing themselves in the field. I myself, when I first started my job, had to consider whether to disclose my identity to my students. And then after I did so, I found that a lot more people were coming to me for advice and how to navigate the field. So there can be a lot of benefits if it's safe to do so for our mentees. So now we have our final tier of recommendations, LGBTQ field scientist recommendations. One is that it's okay to selectively disclose. I often felt a lot of pressure to disclose and felt like I was lying if I wasn't disclosing my identity, but sometimes it's more or less safe depending on the environment you're in, and what you decide now doesn't have to be what you decide for forever. And so we like to recommend that the selective disclosure with the eye of safety is totally okay. Also, we need to be safe from human risks. Research where you're going, make a plan. There are sometimes symbols of hate in areas where I am working, and we make sure to avoid those areas. For example, in the US, the Confederate flag can be a signal that we are in a place that is not as welcoming. And so for us, I always make sure that my team knows where we're going and what the potential risks are. Also, something that needs to be considered is choosing clothing that is both affirming and weather appropriate. So for example, chest binders are not always appropriate depending on the level of binding that happens. And so making sure that there's a plan in place that you can feel affirmed and have the clothing that you need, but also are safe from, for example, extreme heat. and being able to be able to breathe. Another recommendation that we have that has really been quite meaningful to a lot of the students that I've told about this is to bring something symbolic of your identity to stay connected. Nathan, for example, has a book, The Picture of Dorian Gray, that's old and battered, that he brought with on a lot of his fieldwork excursions. I have a student that has a particular hat that has some trans colors on it, but isn't overtly the trans flag. Just a way to stay connected, and even when you might be more isolated or being stealth or something like that. Also, just as Nathan describes before, just being cautious of safety risks when using dating apps, similar to what we talked about with mentors, just being aware that it can be a risk and that those location-based aspects might end up being an issue of safety. We also recommend that where possible, connecting with local LGBTQ communities can be extremely helpful and help reduce the feelings of isolation that a lot of people might feel. So looking ways to engage in that safely is one recommendation. In addition, there are a lot of organizations such as those putting on this webinar that you can engage with online. And so there's a lot of different LGBTQ fieldwork organizations where you can network, share knowledge of safe place and affirming places to work and strategies. And so we recommend that as well. And then finally, we hope that no one has to use reporting mechanisms for if harassment happens, but it's important to be knowledgeable of those reporting mechanisms in case you need to use them. And there can be sometimes a loss of autonomy through those reporting processes. So just knowing what would happen can help you be prepared in case that ends up being needed. And one of the major parts of this framework that we talked about in our paper was ways to go beyond individual action into a broader level of action. And so to illustrate that, we want to talk a bit about trans individuals, and several of the trans folks on our paper put together this figure. So first, when you're talking about pronouns or someone's gender, mistakes can happen. So it's important to know how to make mistakes and recover gracefully. It's important not to make a big scene and make the mistake about you if you're the one making the mistake. If you make multiple mistakes, apologizing in private and not making the individual comfort you can be really an important way to handle that. But you also want to prevent mistakes to begin with. You want to change how you see people, right? So change your cognitive patterns so you're thinking about someone as their appropriate gender. Otherwise, you'll be more prone to mistakes. I often practice with a different friend or my cat to make sure that I am rewiring my brain so that I can use the correct pronouns. Also, we need to move again beyond this into advocating for structural change, advocating for healthcare for trans individuals, looking for justice through institutions and societies, and to oppose heteronormativity and cisnormativity at every turn. So it is important that we are respectful. We should learn how to make mistakes and recover, but we also need to advocate to reduce these structural barriers on a broader scale. So now we have a few concluding thoughts. First, we recommend that mentors and institutions take action for safety, financial, medical, and administrative support needed by LGBTQ field researchers. And we also suggest that LGBTQ scientists prioritize their safety, maintain connection to community and their identities during more isolating fieldwork.
And then we have a few other resources that this author team has put together. So we have a talk on sex determination. And Jamie, if you click again, there should be another paper. We have a paper on data collection for demographic identities and how to do that in an affirming and inclusive manner. And then we talk about kind of the impacts of historic legacies of legislation and policies, as well as culture, on current day LGBTQ rights, with a particularly United States focus, but a similar approach we think would be important for most countries to understand the current landscape by looking into history. And the paper that we presented here has a supplementary with a list of appendices, and we encourage you to check them out for kind of a more intersectional approach towards inclusion, where we try to identify resources for other minoritized groups.
And that is all.
Thank you very much, Jamie and Nathan. Very interesting presentation. We're going to have time for questions later. Now I would pass on the word to Kai. Please feel free to share your screen, and Kai is going to talk about navigating gender at sea.
Great. So I'm going to talk about navigating gender at sea. I'm Kay McMonagle. I'm an assistant professor of oceanography in University of Alaska Fairbanks. And this is a picture from a cruise I was on. I think we're somewhere in the northern Bering Sea during this cruise. So I want to start with a little bit of an introduction to myself as well as to seagoing research. I've spent about 150 days total at sea, and these are on very different ships and for different amounts of time potentially. So some of these cruises have been single day cruises on a smaller ship out of Miami. And then I've been on a cruise that was 55 days long going across the Indian Ocean. Most of my work has been kind of based out of and around South Africa and Alaska. And all of my research has taken place on US or South African ships. So some specifics would depend. Generally speaking, the flag of the ship that you're on is going to be what determines kind of legal questions as well as policies while you're at sea. Some of the challenges of life at sea, I love going to sea. I think it's great, but it can be challenging. One thing is that it's very hierarchical. So the captain is really, at the end of the day, always the person who's in charge when you're at sea. And on the science side of things, there's generally a chief scientist, sometimes a co-chief scientist or other PIs who are in charge. And then there's a very kind of defined structure, particularly within the crew, but sometimes also within the scientists. It's pretty common to work 12-hour shifts at sea, and you usually wouldn't have anything like weekends either, so this might be 55 days of 12-hour shifts every day. Usually you would be sharing a room with someone else, perhaps multiple other people. There are times that you might have a private room, but generally speaking, there's not a lot of space. And even if you did have a private room, you're going to be eating meals with other people. You're just going to be around other people all the time. It's really difficult to find any time kind of to yourself. Wi-Fi, question mark. This is actually highly variable. I think nowadays, at least US ships, a lot of them have Starlink and have really fast Wi-Fi, but when I started going to sea about 10 years ago, there was no Wi-Fi whatsoever when I was on these ships, no way to call anyone, no text messages, absolutely nothing. And it does still depend on the specific ship you're on and the region of the world. You have limited free time that goes along with those 12-hour shifts, but even on your free time, there's really not that many activities. You're quite literally stuck on a boat. There is oftentimes a gym. There might be like a library or a theater to watch movies in, but you can't escape and go somewhere else. You're really limited in what you can do. And so all of this together can mean that there's a lack of access to support systems. So, if you don't have good Wi-Fi and you can't get somewhere alone, there's not really any way that you can necessarily like call up a friend or do like an appointment with a therapist or anything like that. So this can all exacerbate challenging situations. If, imagine you don't get along with someone on the ship and you're going to have to work 12-hour shifts with them every day for the next 2 months, and you don't have a great way to do whatever thing it is you do to center yourself and get calm. So anytime you have some sort of challenge at sea, it can be difficult to tackle. So I'm going to talk about this commentary paper that I led that we published in 2023 in EGU Advances, and it's called Navigating Gender at Sea. This is the full author list. I'll talk a little bit more about these people in just a minute. The goals really with this paper were to establish that transgender and gender diverse people go to sea. When I'm saying gender diverse here, I really mean people who don't necessarily identify as transgender, but might be perceived as being gender non-normative, or who just don't fit kind of cisgender ways of viewing. So maybe they go by a different name or different pronouns, but you don't have to identify as transgender necessarily to fall under some of what I'll talk about. So we wanted to establish that transgender and gender diverse people go to sea because I knew quite a few transgender and gender diverse people that do seagoing research, but I'd never seen anything published about that. Then we wanted to discuss some common issues. So what we did is we had a few Zoom meetups where we talked about what we had experienced and identified some commonalities. And then we wanted to propose some solutions. And in particular, part of why I wanted to raise solutions here is I talked to a lot of cisgender people who lead fieldwork or are helping to fund seagoing research, and they wanted to do things to make it more inclusive, but they didn't know what to do. So we were trying to give people concrete actions for people who are supportive, but are like, I don't know where to start. What do I do? So our author team, we had 13 authors from 12 different institutions, mostly in the US. Most of us were fairly early career and mostly on the scientist side. One person had worked as a crew member on a ship, and I know several transgender crew members, so certainly there are transgender crew on seagoing research vessels, but just as kind of the nature of who I knew and who wanted to be involved in the paper, this was mostly scientists. I'll say the same thing for mostly early career. I know a few later career seagoing oceanographers who are transgender who didn't really want to be involved in the paper. So it's not as if only earlier career transgender people exist. These are just the people who had the time and desire to put their name on a paper saying, yes, I am transgender or gender diverse, and I've gone to sea, and here are some of my experiences. So the framework that we used is we talked about how many, although certainly not all, many transgender and gender diverse people transition in some sense. And when we're thinking about transitioning, we're thinking about legal steps. So this might be changing your name or changing the gender marker on your legal identification. Then we're thinking about some sort of medical transition. This might include hormone replacement therapy and/or surgeries. And we're also thinking about social transition, so changing how you present as far as how you dress, your hair, your makeup, etc., changing pronouns, going by a different name that maybe you don't legally change your name, you just want to go by a different name, and then changing mannerisms. And so many transgender and gender diverse people would do one or more of these steps. And we thought about how these had impacts at sea. And I also want to say that many cisgender people face some of these same issues. So when we're thinking about things like changing your name legally and that creating perhaps problems at sea, lots of cisgender people change their name when they get married or when they get divorced or just if they prefer another name. So this is, not something exclusive to trans people. Lots of people need medication for their mental or physical health and might struggle to get it for a long cruise, again, whether they are transgender or not. Lots of people go by nicknames. And so kind of our framework here is the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats. So we're hoping that these recommendations will make seagoing research more inclusive for transgender people, but also more inclusive in general. Okay, so some of the common experiences our author team had gone through. First, on the legal side, a lot of, well, I shouldn't say a lot, a few of our authors talked about difficulty getting visas to some countries due to having an X gender marker on their passport. So in the US currently, you can get the X gender marker on your passport. There are other countries around the world where that's true as well. But then if you go to get a visa to go to a different country, some of those countries either will deny your visa or they just don't have any process for how to deal with X gender markers. So this could potentially limit where you can go to get on a ship. And then also a common experience was people delayed legal steps of transition because of an upcoming cruise. So if you know it might take you 6 months to get a new passport and you have a cruise coming up in 3 months, you might have to put things off. And that doesn't really sound that annoying until you think about the fact that if seagoing research is a big part of your career, you might be going to sea like 3 or 4 times a year every year. So it kind of becomes impossible. Like, when am I going to update my identification if I'm always leaving for a cruise? On the medical side, a lot of people had difficulty getting prescriptions for long cruises. In the US, at least, oftentimes your insurance won't want to give you a prescription for more than some amount of time. That might be 30 days, that might be 90 days, and then they want you to go back to the pharmacy and get a refill. You can't do that if you're on a ship, and they don't always really understand that idea. And then also difficulty scheduling surgeries. So again, this is something where if you're going on a cruise every 3 months or every 6 months and you're on a waiting list for a surgery, generally they would call you up and say, like, here's the date you're scheduled for. They don't really ask, are you going to be in the middle of the ocean? Does this date work for you? So this had put off some people's transitions by a long time. And then on the social side, people talked about a lack of privacy. This is something that's true in general, but especially on smaller boats where there aren't always bathrooms. That can be a big concern, but also lack of privacy if you are sharing a bedroom with someone else. A lot of people talked about pronouns not being respected, particularly people who use pronouns other than he or she, so they, them, and other pronouns were not necessarily respected. And people talked about being uncomfortable coming out while they were at sea. I'll talk about some of my personal experiences. These aren't in the paper. We really focused on more common experiences, but I just want to talk about some of what I've experienced. So on the legal side, I am non-binary, but I don't have an X on my passport because I know that that would probably make my seagoing opportunities more difficult. And it also took me 6 years after coming out to change my gender marker to male. Some of that was due to COVID and other things. It wasn't always going to sea, but it was really difficult knowing, like, I have a cruise coming up, but I don't know exactly when it is, and I don't know exactly how long it'll take to get my passport back. So it really took me a long time. On the medical side, I've spent hours trying to get medication to go on long cruises. I've always managed to, but this is, you know, I have a prescription, I have good health insurance. It's not something where, like, there really should be any reason it takes this long. It's just that explaining to a pharmacist that you're going to be in the middle of the ocean for the next 2 months, they aren't very helpful, let's say. And then on the social side, on one of my cruises, I was misgendered by a chief scientist for the whole 6-week-long cruise, and it really felt very intentional because no one else on the ship misgendered me, so it was very strange. I've usually managed to either have a private room or to share a room with my spouse, who's also a seagoing oceanographer. Although on the last cruise I was on, I shared a room with another non-binary person. So some of our author team had a lot more issues with having to share a room with someone they were uncomfortable with. I haven't really experienced that as much. We have a table, this is the full table in the paper of recommendations. I'm just going to highlight some of them, but I want to talk about how this is set up. On the left-hand column, we talk about who this recommendation is to. Then we talk about what we're recommending that you do, an example, and then something to avoid for each of these. So I'll go through some of them, but I recommend taking a look at all of them if you're a seagoing oceanographer. So our first recommendation is to everyone, and we recommend that you refer to people the way they ask you to refer to them, as far as their names and their pronouns. Seems pretty simple. Our example here is to model this by introducing yourself using the name you prefer and your pronouns to set the precedent for others, and we recommend avoiding that you require everyone to state their pronouns because that can force people to either misgender themselves or out themselves to other people if they didn't want to be out. And so especially in a situation like fieldwork where people might not be comfortable outing themselves, we don't recommend kind of requiring public sharing of pronouns. Next, we recommend that chief scientists and ship officers ask for birthing preferences for all scientists on board. So we're recommending that instead of matching people up based on something like their gender markers on their passport or the gender you perceive them as, you send a survey ahead of time that says something like, our birthings have 2 bunks. What individuals or genders would you prefer to share with? And again, I think this can be really helpful both for trans people for whom maybe like the gender marker on their passport doesn't match with who they want to share a room with, but also for cisgender people who maybe like really prefer to share a room with their best friend or their spouse who's on board instead of someone random who just happens to have the same gender marker on their passport as the first person. Similarly to our recommendation to chief scientists and ship officers, we recommend checking how ports and places that you're going handle the X gender marker on identification. I'll say even more broadly than this. We recommend, looking into the ports you're going into and out of and kind of what are the rules, what is the culture in that place, and sharing that with your team. I think sometimes people forget because then you're going to spend 55 days on a ship, but you do have to get to that ship, and there might be laws or policies in a country or a state. So of course, as a chief scientist, you can't necessarily change how a different country handles X gender markers, but you can find out that information and communicate it to transgender and gender diverse people. I would actually communicate it to your whole team. And this really signals that it's something that you care about and that you're thinking about. So what we recommend avoiding is don't wait for someone to, go to you and say, I have no idea if I can join this cruise due to the gender marker on my passport. Look into this ahead of time and communicate the information with your team. And then the last recommendation I'll talk about is we recommend that chief scientists, ship officers, and institutions adopt inclusive ethics and codes of conduct and disseminate best practices. So there are some ships that are doing a really good job as far as having codes of conduct, and others that are not doing so great. I think sometimes because they aren't really aware that there are codes of conduct out there. So what we would love is if you're at an institution or work on a ship that has a code of conduct or a best practice, if you will share that with the community, really. And then perhaps those can be shared more broadly. We would also say if you are at a place that has a great code of conduct or some sort of best practice guide, put this on the ship, make it clear that it exists, because some places have these codes of conduct, but you wouldn't know from being on their ship. And the avoid here is avoid assuming everyone already knows appropriate conduct and best practices. Lots of people are well-intentioned, but don't necessarily know what to do with planning a cruise. And so share these things with them. A few takeaway messages. The biggest one I want people to be aware of is that transgender and gender diverse people do conduct seagoing research. And if you're somebody planning a cruise, plan for transgender and gender diverse people to be there. Don't wait for someone to contact you. Plan that these people will be there and push for more inclusive policies and procedures at your institution and on ships that you sail on. And I put my email address at the bottom. Thank you. I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Kay. A very interesting presentation. We can relate to some of the experience with seagoing, and also I guess both presentations have some points in common. And I think there are lots of important messages we should take notes, but is that it's beneficial for everybody to have a field code of conduct or make it inclusive, and the efforts. This is not limited to LGBTQ people because it includes everybody, and there's always a matter of intersectionality that is quite complicated to talk about in 1 hour. So thank you very much for covering so many aspects. And now we have some time for questions. So for people in the audience, you can type it out in the Q&A part, as Clara mentioned, and we can address to our speakers. Asma has a question. I think I can allow them to talk.
It's related to bathrooms, because I'm working actually with one of our guest authors right now on a piece about accessing bathrooms either as gender non-conforming or as trans during field work. And I was wondering if you had any personal experiences while in the field, and if you have any best practices, whether you are a PI, how to protect basically one of your researchers, or whether you're the researchers, how do you navigate that? Thank you.
Thank you, Esma, for this question. I think we can ask first Kay, and then Jamie and Nathan.
Well, my answer will be short because almost all of the time, if you're on a ship large enough to have a bathroom, all of them are treated as gender neutral. So that's actually one really positive thing out of seagoing oceanography, is that unless you're on a very small boat, it's generally kind of a non-issue. I'll let Nathan or Jamie give their input.
My fieldwork context, we don't have bathrooms, we just have the land. And so the way that I do it with my field team is, regardless of identity or background, we use the buddy system. I make sure that each field site students kind of know the areas that are kind of hidden from view. And then like there's like, you know, a ditch or a shrub. Like I've been out there, so I know where all of the spots are. And then we make sure that there's someone kind of some distance away that's keeping an eye, just in case a landowner or someone else were to come, so that no one is alone in the field. The buddy system is kind of how we navigate that, and also communicating the best spots for privacy. Because again, I work in grasslands, so it's pretty open out there.
So that
For
sounds like
me,
two instances of gender neutral bathrooms, and yet the world hasn't set on fire. That's good to know.
for me, there's kind of different settings where this applies, where one, you're doing a lot of field work in inhabited areas where you're stopping at stores or things like that, where you're not going to be able to change the policy of that store. For situations in those situations, or those locations, I often offer to be kind of a door guard. So if somebody wants to use the bathroom, I say, hey, I'm happy to stand outside while you use that. And if anybody tries to enter, I say, hey, somebody's using it and you can't go in right now. And that's been pretty effective. In terms of more field-based housing, that's generally a conversation to have with the field house. And I think that there's ways to navigate those conversations where it's a lived, shared environment of, okay, we're going to make these gender neutral and this is how we're going to do it. And just be very intentional about the decision-making process and how you can best protect people's privacy as well as their identity. And there's a lot of examples of turning multi-facility use rooms into single or into multi-gender use. So looking at some of the ways this has been done in other areas could also be useful.
Just as an example, at the institutional level, my building here does not yet have gender neutral bathrooms. We've added them to every other building. And there's currently laws in the US that are being enacted in nearby states that are targeting higher education, including private institutions of higher education, where people aren't allowed to use bathrooms legally that don't match with the gender they were assigned at birth. So my institution has immediately started planning to convert all of our restrooms to gender neutral if this law starts to come into play where I'm living. So this is also an institutional thing, that if you have buildings with bathrooms, that if there's some sort of legal thing happening where your students might not have access to a bathroom, then just being ready with a plan. Our plan is to just put locks on all the bathrooms and make them single use if we have to. And in the meantime, we are also trying to convert them into like a full gender neutral bathroom that matches our building codes. So just having plans in place and being aware of the legalities also can be important. I wish I wasn't in the state that I'm in sometimes with some of these laws, but we are also trying to find a way to support our students at the same time.
Yes, thank you. The changes can be done at institutional level, but there is a support needed. And probably if in some places there are not even a first like LGBT group supporting each other. So that's also a good place to start in a bottom-up way, and kind of copying up what other people have been doing to get to the point to have, say, gender neutral toilets. So in the process to get to what we need. As I must say, the buddy system sounds great, and thank you all for answering my question. I appreciate it. Thank you. We have time for another question if somebody wants to ask one. Clara?
I just so I think it was a common theme that I think, you know, in both talks we mentioned about how, and you picked up on this, like making these rules, making these changes are good for everyone. You know, it's not just for LGBT people, it's good for everyone. And I think it is also just sort of worth saying that this, you know, if people know what to expect and little changes, these are little changes, but sometimes these little changes just mean that you're happier at work and you get a lot more work out of people. And sometimes that's awareness, sometimes that's planning, sometimes it's openness, you know, being honest. And I think it was touched on about selective disclosure. And obviously that's easier for some people than others. And I know that I've heard of trans people going back in the closet, but do you have any recommendations? Because, you know, the truth is that it's not safe to go to some countries and you might still want to go there because you want to meet the people, do some work there. So do you, and this is also for Kay as well, but do you have any advice on navigating sort of selective disclosure?
So I don't do international field work, but the state where I do rural field work in the US has some pretty unwelcoming policies, and I still go there and still bring students there, and I do feel conflicted about it. There is a population of grassland birds there that really need to be studied, so I care about conservation, so I'm studying them. So what I make sure is that risks are known. And that's something that I think is really important, being informed at risks and full disclosure, knowing what you're getting into, and then having systems for safety in place and prioritizing safety. You know, I live, you know, some people are like, well, why do you still go there? I'm like, well, I live there. You know, there's LGBTQ people living in all these places around the world, you know, so just being as knowledgeable as you can, talking to someone who's been to the place, and knowing the risks is the best that I can say in terms of my personal experience.
And I think in particularly, if you're going to one of these countries where identities are criminalized, talking to your embassy in that country can also provide a lot of like legal responses that might happen if somebody on your team or yourself wind up in legal issues, and kind of making sure that you have a full plan for kind of worst case scenario with that. It's not always the most joyous preparation for a trip, but it's one of those considerations that I think is pretty important.
Yeah, I guess I can say a little bit. I mean, personally, I travel a lot of places, and that's kind of my attitude is I'm not going to let much stop me, but definitely being aware of the risks. And I think really actually like genuinely doing your research is a really important part. For instance, people are sometimes really surprised that I do a lot of work out of South Africa, and there's some safety concerns there in general, but gay marriage has been legal in South Africa for far longer than it has been in the US. They're pretty LGBT friendly, particularly in bigger cities. So I wouldn't shy away from just fear without knowing the situation, but definitely looking into laws and trying to talk to people. If there's, say, you know, a university near wherever you're going, you can look up an LGBT organization at that university and contact them, and, you know, try to get more information about kind of the lived reality, which isn't always what you would find from, say, the laws.
Yeah, and I liked there was the recommendation earlier of have something that, you know, you said that one of your colleagues had a hat that was sort of the trans colors, but it was also a bit ambiguous. I guess my big massive rainbow tattoo on my leg is probably a little bit less subtle, but there you go. I know we've got 2 more questions, but we're also at an hour, so
No, yeah, we can take them, Clara. We can take
okay.
them. Yeah. Do you want to read them?
Oh, yeah, sure. So the first one, can you share, I hope you're okay staying. Can you share some examples of some policies or practices that have successfully improved LGBTQ plus inclusivity and representation in field-based geoscience research?
So I'm an ecologist, but I think that these things are going to be relevant in a geoscience context. Just two things that I have done. One is we read a paper on fieldwork safety before we go to the field and have a discussion about it. A lot of these early career folks have never thought about these things. And the paper that we read is intersectional and talks a lot about like safety for people from racialized minorities and in addition to religion and all kinds of different things and disability. So really wide encompassing. So just starting that conversation as a mentor helps people think about these things. And the goal for me is for these students to see a lot of these barriers as structural and not about themselves doing something wrong. And that is something that sometimes understanding the field more broadly can help. And the other policy that I have is that we have a fieldwork safety plan with the institution, with the students, and that goes through things like bathrooms and housing, in addition to all of the other safety things like what you do if you get a flat tire and all of these other things. And finally, we use radios. And for my field site, this means that we are always in contact with each other because you can get really good radios that can go really long distances. That might not be relevant in all fieldwork contexts, but it's something that I have found that has increased safety measurably. And I feel a lot better about taking my young students into the field.
I think your comments about the comments earlier about, you know, checking with the embassy, checking with people in that city, look at resources online. I think being prepared is the most important thing you can do. It's not going to remove safety issues altogether, but at least you know, and then you can make an informed decision as to whether you go to that place or not.
And I think a lot of it is really about, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No.
Oh, I was just going to say, and I think a lot of it is just about being transparent as well. You know, this isn't necessarily just LGBTQ, but seeing if there's a fridge for medication at the field site, knowing what the bathrooms are going to be like at the field site. And all of this will increase the ability of everybody to participate in field work. And I have seen direct benefits of people doing field work, also in ecology, so not necessarily in geosciences, but I've had field technicians and students who are now in professional careers doing field work who at different times thought that they had to leave the field because they were LGBTQ.
Yeah, and I think that, and again, things change. Things can change quite quickly. We've seen that a lot over Europe. So, yeah. So thank you. There is also another question from Esme. I realize that Jamie, you are typing some stuff, but are there any? Oh, it's gone. Are there any resources available, especially sort of Europe-based ones? I personally haven't seen loads. I know the Royal Society of Chemistry actually put a thing in, because sometimes you also have to consider that people are coming to the UK or coming to the US or wherever it is, and their home country, it might not be safe and legal. And then it's a question of, do they stay at your country? Do they move back and things like that? So it's not a thick resource, but it does at least have some links. This is from the Royal Society of Chemistry. But I don't know of any other amazing ones. Maybe somebody else has some.
I know Apex have lots of resources too, and they have like a database with links and resources. That's definitely worth checking. They work in the cryosphere, but again, as fieldwork is kind of common, so it doesn't really matter the subject if you go looking for birds or for rocks.
And I just put a link over that Jamie had put answering a question as well. So there's zendo.org.
Okay, thank you. I think we finished up the questions, and it could be a good time to wrap up at least the recorded part. We could stay later if you want to stay and unrecorded. I want to just share one last slide to kind of wrap up, and we want to have the key take-home messages. Its inclusion requires action across structural level, and not only. The safety needs to be prioritized. This is beneficial not only for LGBTQ people who were the subject of this webinar, but for women and other minorities. And regardless of your position, you can take action. You as an ally, you as a person going fieldwork, you can definitely take some notes maybe from this webinar and bring it home, bring it to your institution, and make a field work safer for everybody. And there are going to be more resources in the description. Thanks everybody for being with us. Thank you again, Clara. Thank you again, Jamie, Nathan, and Kay, and EGU for hosting this. Yeah, it was great to see you.